Okay, I'm just going to give people a minute here to join. We're just going to give people a few more minutes here and then we'll get started. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started and we'll let everybody else join. Thank you all so much for joining us today to discuss the KREBIOZEN hoax, how a mysterious cancer drug shook organized medicine. My name's Sam Ellinger. I'm the publicity coordinator at the University of Illinois Press. I'm just going to go over the plan a little bit for today, quickly introduce our guests, and we'll get started. Our guests are going to chat for about 45 minutes, and that'll leave us about 15 minutes for questions. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use the promo code HOLIDAY50 to get 50% off the book and any books from the University of Illinois Press through December 31st. I'm going to put the promo code and a link to the book in the chat box. I'll be recording the event, and I'm going to post it on our YouTube channel in the days following the event. You'll receive an email after the event with a link to our YouTube channel and the discount code as well. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Ehrlich is a professor emeritus of journalism at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's previously published 5 books, including Dangerous Ideas on Campus and Kansas City versus Oakland. Ryan Ross is the Director of History and Traditions Programs at the University of Illinois Alumni Association. He's also the Senior Editor of the Illinois Alumni Magazine and the Curator and Collections Manager of the U of I's Heritage Museum, which is called the Richmond Family Welcome Gallery. Dr. Ehrlich, Ryan, thank you for joining us today. Over
Thanks,
to you.
Sam.
Thanks, Sam. So in the KREBIOZEN hoax, Matthew Ehrlich tells the story of an alleged cancer cure that became popular in the early 1950s after it was championed by Dr. Andrew Ivy, a U of I vice president and noted physiologist who Time magazine once called the conscience of U.S. science. The drug was widely covered in the news media and became controversial after its inventor, Stefan Rovic, yes. I wrote it out phonetically for myself, but not in my introduction because I'm, what a maroon. Anyway, Durovic refused to reveal information about its chemical makeup and manufacture and dodged repeated attempts from the university and government officials to analyze it. So ultimately, the kerfuffle over KREBIOZEN led to congressional hearings, fraud trials, and libel suits, the forced resignation of U of I President George Stoddard, the reputational ruin of Andrew Ivy, and changes in the way the federal government approves new medications. And we'll talk about all that and more over the next 45 minutes or so. So, Matt, to start, let's set the stage by providing some context about what was going on at the U of I at the time and in the United States. So can you talk a little bit about what the social, economic, and political environment was that gave rise to KREBIOZEN?
Yeah, so this drug and the whole controversy that surrounded it came out of a period of great optimism and great change, the era immediately following World War II. So at the University of Illinois, 1946, there's a new president. His name is George Stoddard, who comes to the U of I from the East. He was a commissioner of education in New York State. And he comes to the university with the mandate to transform things. He's a younger president. He's still in his 40s. He replaced Arthur Willard. Arthur Willard was the previous president and had been like 20 years older. And so when Stoddard comes in, he really is given the mandate to try to shake things up, and he does by hiring scores of new faculty, by instituting new programs. And this all corresponds with a feeling of, you know, we've been through a whole lot in the United States in the previous decades. We've been through the Depression, we've been through the upheaval of World War II, and now with the coming of peace, it's going to be unparalleled prosperity and good feelings. And that was, in fact, the case at the University of Illinois in a lot of ways, with great excitement on campus. I mean, I have a personal connection to this because my father actually was a returning World War II veteran. This was, of course, the age of the GI Bill. So he came back to campus and he just remembered it being a wonderful time to be an undergraduate student. But with all the change that was taking place, there was also a backlash against, for example, new faculty members coming in at much higher salaries than those of the people who had been there previously, about these people coming in with newfangled ideas, like in the College of Commerce, Keynesian economic theory, which seemed to be taking precedence over practical business training. And also, within a very short time period, all the optimism that was in the air as of 1946 seemed to evaporate with the deepening of the Cold War and concerns about communism. And so by 1950 or so, the Korean War has started, the communists have taken over China, Soviets have detonated an atomic bomb, and a lot of campus units, including the College of Commerce, which I mentioned briefly, but other units as well at the University of Illinois, are engulfed in turmoil over all the changes that have happened. So KREBIOZEN, this drug, comes out of a period both of great hope and of great fear.
So tell me, how did the U of I get tied in with KREBIOZEN?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the things that George Stoddard did when he was president at the University of Illinois was try to bring in a lot of very high profile new faculty. And arguably, the most high profile new hire at that time was the gentleman that you mentioned at the outset, Andrew Ivy, who was, as of 1946, considered to be one of the world's foremost scientists. As you said, Time magazine had called him in 1946 the conscience of U.S. science. He had been the designated spokesperson for medical ethics at the Nuremberg trials in Germany, testifying for the prosecution of Nazi scientists who had conducted sadistic medical experiments on prisoners. He had been at Northwestern University, Andrew Ivy, for many years. And so the University of Illinois poached him from Northwestern. There's a long tradition in academia of universities trying to poach each other's star faculty. And this is the case with the U of I, University of Illinois, getting Andrew Ivy to head the University of Illinois' medical programs in Chicago. So at first, this works out beautifully for the U of I. It's a big publicity coup. Ivy helps the university greatly enhance its external research funding. He helps accelerate the building program for the university's hospital facilities and medical facilities in Chicago. But then, corresponding right about with 1950 and 1951, which was the time that, as I said, the university was engulfed in controversy, and Stoddard, the new president, increasingly came under challenge. That was the exact moment that KREBIOZEN appeared on the scene. And KREBIOZEN came to the attention of Andrew Ivy by the other guy you mentioned, Stefan Durovic, who was this very mysterious doctor. He was originally from Montenegro, part of what was then called Yugoslavia. His story was that he had been forced to leave his homeland during World War II by the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia. He had to take refuge in Argentina. And while he was in Argentina, he had come up with a mysterious medication that he said he invented by injecting horses in a farm in Argentina with some sort of substance. And then he bled the horses and from the horse serum extracted this powder that would be a miraculous treatment for cancer, boost the human body's natural immunity to cancer. And Ivy, who again, one of the world's most respected scientists, is intrigued because he's actually written about the biology of cancer and has had a personal interest that Dorovic probably knew about when he pitched this drug, a natural interest in how the human body defends itself against cancer, how human cell growth is naturally regulated so it doesn't spiral out of control, as is the case with cancer. And so Ivy did something very curious. He directed a couple of his associates, one in particular at the U of I's facilities in Chicago, to administer this completely unknown, untried substance, a substance that Stefan Dorovic would not reveal any details of what was in it, any details of how it was manufactured. So it was a secret remedy, which is a big red flag in organized medicine. Ivy still went ahead and administered this to a couple of people with terminal cancer. And even though he didn't really expect anything to happen, actually, the two patients seemed to respond really well. And so that's what really got Ivy interested in the drug. And that's where the whole problem began.
So one of the things that I found most interesting about this whole saga of Dorovic meeting Ivy and then pitching this cancer drug to him is that that's not the reason that he came to the United States at all. He initially he was going to Northwestern to try to sell them on a different drug that he'd said he invented. That was a blood pressure medication that he supposedly had administered to 5,000 people in Argentina, some of whom were at the highest levels of Perón's government. And so, you know, he was coming here with this miracle blood pressure drug that he was trying to sell to Northwestern. Talk about you know, how that turned out for him and how that led him to Ivy.
Yeah, he and his brother Marco, who would be another player in this story, had a company in Buenos Aires, and they were pitching these medicines that Dorovic, who did hold a medical degree from Yugoslavia, but otherwise had never published in a medical journal, never had published in a scientific journal, was totally unknown by the organized medical community. They came up with these medicines, and the first one, as you mentioned, was a hypertension medicine called cosiderin. And the Durovics were brought to the United States and Chicago specifically by a couple of American businessmen, one of whom ran a company, a pump manufacturer company in suburban Chicago in Morton Grove. And the whole idea was that Stefan Dorovic, would get the attention of the American academic medical community. So first he goes to Northwestern University, Stefan Dorovic, and they tell him, you know, this hypertension medicine isn't really worth anything, and they quickly send him on his way. And that's when Dorovic showed up at Andrew Ivy's office. Again, Ivy used to work at Northwestern, and Northwestern's medical dean, who would soon become Northwestern's president, is the one who said, "We're not interested. Maybe you go visit Andrew Ivy at the U of I. Maybe he would be interested." And it's fascinating to speculate on what the motivation of the Northwestern person might have been. like, oh, you abandoned Northwestern for the University of Illinois. Okay, you deal with this very strange visitor from Argentina. But yeah, Durovic first pitched Cosiderin, the hypertension medicine, to Andrew Ivy. Andrew Ivy said, I'm not interested in that. And then Durovic went away, and a couple of days later, he came back and said, oh, I've got a second medicine. It's a cancer medicine. I can't tell you what's in it, just like I couldn't tell you what's in the hypertension medicine. I can't tell you how I made the medicine other than sketchy details about it involves horses or cattle or some form of livestock. I mean, Andrew Ivy should have turned around and run, fled, locked his office, but he didn't. He was open, and in a way, maybe it was commendable. He didn't want to slam the door on any potential cancer medication at a time when a great deal was not known about cancer, where there really wasn't a very effective treatment regimen for cancer. You know, chemotherapy of any kind was still in its infancy at that point. So, with the cancer medicine, at least, he went ahead and started to test it. And the fact was, he was not a cancer specialist, he was not a clinician. And what his patients were telling him was, you know, you injected me with this and I feel better. I think I'd have less pain. And the tumor size seemed to have shrunk somewhat. But subjective reports from patients of pain relief doesn't necessarily equate effective cancer treatment. And just seeming shrinkage of a tumor that can be attributable to all sorts of things that, again, doesn't necessarily have to do with effective cancer treatment. And some of Ivy's more experienced colleagues, more experienced in cancer treatment, and there were a lot of them in Chicago at the U of I at that time, he wouldn't listen to them. He just went ahead and then eventually in 1951 announced this drug to the world with a news conference at the Drake Hotel in Chicago.
So one thing that I thought was interesting that you pointed out about Ivy is that even though he has this great reputation as a physiologist, he he had never actually worked on the staff of a hospital, and he hadn't performed any sort of surgery on anyone since 1922. Um, but he had these very strong ideas about how to treat cancer, and you just sort of rolled with it. Um, what you were talking about how Durovic came to pitch this hypertension drug, and then a couple days later he says to Ivy, "Well, I got this cancer drug." I mean, hindsight being 2020 and everything, it seems so obvious that maybe the cancer drug and the hypertension drug are the exact same drug. Uh, but you know,
Mhm.
what you were saying about how Ivy didn't want to slam the door on anything that could potentially help, but it just seems so obvious today that it was probably the same thing. And you know,
Yeah, the hypertension medicine was called Cosiderin. The cancer drug would be called KREBIOZEN. So similar names. Again,
mhm,
they both seem to be derived from horses or maybe cattle or maybe something else.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, the deal with Ivy was he had his hand in all sorts of different things. He was a physiologist. He was a laboratory kind of guy as opposed to a clinician. He didn't
mhm.
typically work directly with hospital patients the way that a lot of his colleagues did. But he, you know, was best known as a gastroenterologist. He studied ulcers. He studied things like the physiological impact of parachute jumping during World War II, how to convert salt water into potable water for human consumption, you know, lots and lots and lots of different things. And cancer was just one of these sorts of things. The man also had an ego, a substantial ego. Again, when somebody calls you, when Time magazine, which was enormously influential at that time, calls you the conscience of U.S. science, you would be hard pressed not to let that go to your head a little bit.
Well, I remember you mentioning that, you know, once this whole KREBIOZEN situation blew up and there started to be, legislative hearings about it, uh, Ivy being on the stand under oath and saying that he had never been wrong about anything,
Yeah.
which is
Um,
just crazy. That's a crazy thing to say.
well, it does not, it's not evidence of a lack of self-confidence and a lack of self-worth. That's
Yeah.
one way of putting it. But
So
yeah, yeah.
kind of along those lines, you had mentioned how the way that Ivy announced this drug to the world was with a press conference at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, instead of writing a peer-reviewed journal article about it or having some sort of rigorous testing. So why do can you talk a little bit about why he chose to um, you know present the drug in this way in such a public fashion?
Well, part of it surely had to be the fact that he knew that he was dealing with a secret remedy. The Durovics, Stefan Durovic, the doctor who came up with this medicine, and Marco Durovic, his brother, who came to Chicago from Argentina to help him promote the drug. I mean, they had gone so far as to dissolve the entire supply of KREBIOZEN that they had in mineral oil and seal it in ampules without talking to Andrew Ivy about it. And Ivy later said, well, I almost abandoned the project right then and there. And again, he should have. He
Mhm.
had so many opportunities to cut bait, to distance himself from this before it became public, but he just would not do it. And in part, that was because of his arrogance. We can, I think, label it as that, and his stubbornness, but also because he genuinely was interested in a potential cancer treatment. But specifically, so I mean, why he decided to go public with it in this way, that he knew would circumvent the normal process of peer review, which would point out, hey, this is a secret remedy. That right there should blow up the whole thing, and we shouldn't even be wasting time considering the matter. A news conference was one way around that. But there also was the fact that the Durovics, who were on temporary visitor permits, were about to have to leave the country. And if they left the country of the United States, they were going to take the medicine with them. And Ivy really did not want that to happen. And it wasn't just Ivy. If Andrew Ivy was the only person who was interested in this drug, again, it never would have turned into the big um, controversy that it did turn out being. It was also one of Ivy's close friends, U.S. Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois, who quickly got interested in the drug himself because Douglas long had an interest in alternative medicines and had great skepticism about the federal government's role in organized medicine. So Douglas was one of the people who said, look, I, Senator Douglas, can get the Durovics permanent residency in the United States, but it would really help if you got some publicity for this drug, this cancer drug that you've been testing with apparently really good results. And so that's what prompted Ivy to call this news conference. Unfortunately, there was also a publicist they were working with, and this publicist apparently on his own accord, decided he was going to publicize this event by sending out a news release to the Chicago news media saying, the battle of medical science to find a cure for cancer has achieved its realization. And the Chicago news media, being what it was like, holy wow, that's unbelievable. And descended on the Drake Hotel. The whole thing blew up in the news media, and the University of Illinois was blindsided because Ivy had not, he was the vice president again of the University of Illinois, the number two person at the University of Illinois. He
Mhm.
did not bother telling George Stoddard, the number one person at the university. He did not bother telling his medical dean at the time. So the university was essentially blindsided by this announcement. And when it comes out in the news media that there's an apparently revolutionary cancer treatment at the University of Illinois, of course, people around the country and actually literally around the world bombard the university with calls and telegrams asking for and begging for this medicine. There was an estimated 11,000 such messages in the immediate aftermath of this news conference. And when that happened, and other lawmakers besides Paul Douglas got hold of it, specifically members of the Illinois legislature, and you mentioned that legislative hearings eventually ensued, and specifically members of the Illinois legislature who really did not like George Stoddard
Hmm.
because, again, he was perceived to be a radical, someone who was irreligious, someone who was dangerously liberal, someone who was an internationalist for working with UNESCO.
Hmm.
They say, this guy, George Stoddard in the university, don't really seem to be on board with this whole endeavor. Maybe we could use KREBIOZEN to kind of use it as a club against George Stoddard to try to embarrass him, to try to undercut his leadership. And there were also lawmakers from Chicago, in the Chicago area, who were very close to Andrew Ivy because Ivy had been based in the Chicago area for quite a while, for a long
Hmm.
time. Again, he had been at Northwestern and Evanston. But there also was the fact, or at least there were rumors, that Ivy, in helping expand the University of Illinois Chicago medical facilities, might have been serving patronage interests in Chicago.
Hmm.
And, by choice positions in the university clinics, he might have been doling those out to influential people in Chicago and friends of lawmakers and building contracts for the new construction. So that helped fuel the hearings. And also fueling the hearings were the fact that uh, the Durovic brothers and Andrew Ivy as well were saying organized medicine, which is expressing skepticism of the secret remedy, specifically the American Medical Association,
Hmm.
um, they don't really have legitimate complaints against this drug. What they're really trying to do is grab control of it themselves. They're conspiring to seize financial control of KREBIOZEN, and if they can't do that, then they're going to squelch the medicine by any means necessary. And so there was a lot of conspiracy talk in the air. In a very short time period, this, again, it seems ridiculous, but it became a very, very big deal in Illinois.
So you've got Andrew Ivy, who is, the conscience of U.S. science, and then you got Senator Paul Douglas, who was called the conscience of the Senate.
Right.
And so with two people like that spearheading something, it's pretty hard. I mean, that just automatically gave it legitimacy. And then some of the politicians that you're talking about from the west side of Chicago, um, you had legislators who had been good friends with Al Capone, and so there's a mob element to it. And the previous medical dean uh, for the U of I had been unwilling to do these patronage things you're talking about, and so they got him sacked. But now here's Ivy, who it appears is playing along with them, and so there were just so many. Um, there were a lot of powerful people who were really invested in him not going down because of this alleged cancer cure.
Yeah, and some of the motives were pretty nefarious, and you mentioned those. And some of the motives were actually good. And I think that's really important to stress because, like Paul Douglas, as you said, was also in Time magazine, actually called the contra. Well, he was called one of the mavericks of of the U.S. Senate, which he was. He was a liberal Democrat, but he also took um, some positions that would seem to be more conservative. So he was a maverick in that sense. But yeah, a lot of his colleagues considered Paul Douglas to be the conscience of the Senate. And Douglas had legitimate concerns about organized medicine. A lot of the support for KREBIOZEN and a lot of support for other quack cures for cancer, quack medicines for cancer, and for other medical ills. They would never gain any traction if there weren't a lot of really legitimate concerns that have been around for many, many years. It's not something that's new about organized medicine and about specifically about cancer treatment.
Hmm.
For example, I mentioned the American Medical Association, which only a few months after Ivy's news conference at the Drake Hotel in Chicago published a report in the Journal of the American Medical Association saying, look, we, the AMA, looked at 100 case studies of Crebiacin patients. 98 of the 100 showed no beneficial objective results whatsoever. 44 of the 100 have since died. And so we just cannot see any possible benefits to this. A lot of people immediately said, yeah, but that's the AMA. How can we trust the AMA? And they had good reason to distrust the AMA because the AMA was a trade organization acting on the financial behalf of doctors in really strong-armed sort of ways, including vigorous opposition to any sort of group health insurance. Perry Truman, when he was after the 1948 election, when Truman was inaugurated for a full term in office, he had tried to push national health insurance, and the AMA led the fight to get that defeated. So when the Durovic brothers and Andrew Ivy said, well, the AMA is involved in a conspiracy against this, this cancer medicine, which just deserves a fair chance. Just give Crebiacin a fair chance. That resonated with a lot of people. So yeah, some folks were just like, well, we want the cash to keep flowing in Chicago, or
Hmm.
we really want to get rid of this liberal progressive University of Illinois President George Stoddard by any means necessary. That fueled part of the support of Crebiacin, but it was also like, look, we don't have a cure for cancer. We don't really have an effective treatment regimen for cancer. Why should we automatically slam the door, especially when it's a really respected scientist who seems to be saying that it has real promise? So it was a double-edged sword in that
Hmm.
sense.
And yet, at the same time, there are so many people who supported it, and yet Durovic, every time that he was asked to, provide a sample or to talk about how it was made, he was just squirrely, uh,
That's one
and
word for it.
slippery. He
Yeah,
was.
that's another.
We can keep going all
Yeah.
day, but he just he made it clear that he was never going to turn over these things or divulge any information about it. And so finally, Stoddard said, well, if that's the case, then the U of I is not going to invest any more time or money in this. And, that with what you were already talking about how this drug and you know, the sort of hoopla around it led to his ouster. Could you talk a little bit more about that, about how Stoddard responded to Crebiazin, what he did, and how
Yeah.
that ultimately led to him being, you know, forced to resign?
Yeah. So the initial announcement of Crebiacin in Chicago was March 1951. As I mentioned, Stoddard knew nothing about the drug before then, but he stuck by Andrew Ivy, which, he may have had mixed feelings about that. But again, the fact of the matter was Andrew Ivy was an enormously influential person at the university, arguably, again, the highest profile new hire under Stoddard. So Stoddard tried to stick by him for a long time. And it wasn't until November 1952, or more than a year and a half after the initial announcement of the drug, that Stoddard, because specifically Stefan Durovic refused to cooperate, said, "Look, this whole thing is a farce. I am the university as university president, dissociating the university forevermore from this drug." And he signed off his public statement on that matter
Hmm.
with the four underlined words, "Krebiozin does not exist." That was his opinion. And that really annoyed a lot of people. That's what helped trigger the legislative hearings in Springfield and also in Chicago about the alleged conspiracy against Krebiozin and the role that the university might have played against it. Those hearings were a public circus. They went on for months. And while they were in recess in July of 1953, that's when the Board of Trustees had a marathon budget meeting in the Alumni Union in Urbana. And it was around about midnight that the trustees told George Stoddard, "Could you just step out of the room for a moment?" And they deliberated in an executive session for a few minutes, called Stoddard back in and said, "We just voted no confidence in you." And he immediately resigned. And famously, the trustee who called for that vote was Red Grange, the
Hmm.
galloping ghost, who was one of the greatest football heroes in Illinois history, arguably today still is the greatest football player in Illinois history. And he led the move against George Stoddard. The legislative hearings went on for a few months after that, ended up saying no conspiracy charges whatsoever had been proved. The university didn't do anything wrong. So that's what finally got the University of Illinois free from the whole matter. But then Krebiozin had become a nationwide cause. Then you've got people all around the country, people like Gloria Swanson,
Hmm.
the movie actress, the star of Sunset Boulevard, became an advocate for it. You saw um, groups in towns ranging from Lebanon, Pennsylvania to Akron, Ohio, to suburban New York City, groups there taking up Krabiozin's cause, all pushing for a so-called fair test of the drug that never happened, partly because Andrew Ivy kept saying, the only way a test of this drug is going to work is if I, Andrew Ivy, closely supervise the test. And organized medicine said, no, you can't do that. You're not an objective observer of this. You clearly have your own personal interest in seeing this drug succeed. We cannot possibly get behind any test that you control. And so it wasn't just Durovic who was sabotaging any efforts to objectively evaluate Kerbiasin. By this point, Andrew Ivy was doing it too.
Yeah, and there were so many groups that were perfectly willing to do the test, and then it was all usually it was almost like an 11th hour situation where Ivy would say, "Well, I need to be on the committee that settles this, or I need to personally administer all the tests myself." And then they would just say, "Forget it. That's insane."
Yeah, and so it was the American Cancer Society that
Hmm.
was going to do the test for a while, and then the National Cancer Institute. And yeah, it was that. It was, and part of the reason they really did not want to get involved with Crebiasin. They were highly skeptical of the drug.
Hmm.
People like Paul Douglas, who was a very influential member of Congress, kept putting public pressure on them. And that was part of the reason that they even were willing to entertain the idea. But it finally got to the point where they said, no, we're just not going to do it.
Where I mean, he even talked to Lyndon Johnson about it, and there was a White House committee set up to investigate it.
Yeah, that was obvious. That was later.
Hmm.
By this thing kept going on and on and on. It boggles my mind to think how long it went on over something that seemed so nebulous. But
Hmm.
what happened was in the early 1960s, Congress passed new, tougher federal drug laws that led to the interstate shipment of Crebiacin being banned. And
Hmm.
that really set off a panic among Krebiasin's patients because and Krebiasin supporters spanned the political spectrum. There were a lot of very socially conscious individuals who were taking the drug or whose loved ones were taking the drug. Rachel Carson took the drug, the author
Hmm.
of Silent Spring, and she knew all about the controversy surrounding the medicine, but she had had really bad experiences with organized medicine because she had breast cancer. Her male doctor had lied to her about the extent of her disease. There was a very paternalistic medical establishment at that time. So she took the drug, got no relief from it, and quickly stopped taking it after a few weeks or months. But by 1963, the Food and Drug Administration had conducted an investigation and had said crebiazin is worthless. The National Cancer Institute had done an independent investigation and had said crebiazin is worthless. And Paul Douglas, the US Senator, said, I don't believe the FDA. I don't believe the NCI. I'm going to do my own independent research. And yes, he approached President Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson said, okay. And why did LBJ do this? Because it was 1964. He had just taken office and he wanted to get a lot of stuff done in Congress. All the civil rights legislation, all the medical legislation, all the other Great Society stuff that LBJ really wanted to accomplish. He really needed Paul Douglas's support as
Mhm.
a liberal Democratic U.S. Senator. And so he said, okay, I'll go along with this, set up your independent research committee. And so Douglas really tried, and Stefan Durovic said, no, I'm not going to cooperate. So
Of course he did.
again, all this political capital that Douglas had expended over the years went for naught.
Hmm.
And the result of that, just to kind of bring the story toward its conclusion, was there was a criminal trial where Andrew Ivy, Stefan Durovic, Marko Durovic, and another doctor they had been working with all stood trial in Chicago. That trial lasted 9 months from the spring of 1965 all the way into the winter of 1966. Julius Hoffman, the judge who later would oversee the trial of the Chicago Seven,
Hmm.
was the trial judge in that case, and everybody was acquitted. The jury acquitted everyone of all the charges, all the fraud charges against them. Those verdicts were tainted by accusations of jury tampering, which turned out to be true. The jurors had been circulating pro-Krebiasin materials in direct violation of Judge Hoffman's orders. One of the jurors ended up going to prison for jury tampering. Stefan Durovic fled the country on tax evasion charges, ended
Hmm.
up in Switzerland, reunited with one of his overseas bank accounts with all this money he had apparently extracted from the United States. They had been charging $9.50 per ampule donation for crebiasin, even though the actual manufacturing cost was only about 8 cents per ampule.
Hmm.
So that was the end of it. And Andrew Ivy, to the end of his days, he passed away in 1978, still was saying, crebiasin or a crebiasin-like drug, he came up with his own substitute that he called Carcalon. It deserves a fair chance. One of these days it's going to be vindicated. And of course, it never was.
And well, one thing one thing I thought was most interesting about that trial was that it was the up to that time, it was the longest trial in the history of the Chicago Federal District Court. And uh, it just seems like every single sort of formal uh, hearing that was involved with this drug just turned into some kind of a circus.
Mhm.
And that was no exception with this trial. And then, meanwhile, Stoddard had written his own book about crebiazin, which led to, Ivy and the Durovics and other people who were involved trying to suppress its publication. And then Ivy sued him for libel, and that went on forever, and was still hanging out at the time of this fraud trial.
Yeah,
And the U of I ended up, there was the mandatory retirement age was 68
mhm.
at the time, and so Ivy was turning 68, and so they were going to force him to retire, but he tried to get the legislature to increase the age so that he wouldn't have to leave, um, but he was unsuccessful. And then he ended up convincing Roosevelt University to give him a non-salaried faculty position with a lab, as on the condition that he would pay himself for any renovations And so he ended up spending a lot of money to convert this lab so that he could do more cancer research. But then eventually they forced him out too. And
Yeah.
it's just it's definitely a case of oh, how the mighty have fallen.
Yeah, Ivy was forced out as vice president at the same time George Stoddard was forced out as president back in 1953. But he stayed on the medical faculty at the University of Illinois until the mandatory retirement age was reached in 1961. And then, as you mentioned, went to Roosevelt University. And he himself did not pay for the renovations. His friends did. And he had a lot of people giving him money for his Kerbiasin research. Again, a very broad-based level of support for the drug. And, you mentioned the fact that so many of these things dragged on for so long. That was part of the reason I was reluctant to write about all this, because it just seemed there were a whole lot of rabbit holes to potentially disappear down. But
Mhm.
the reason I think this case, just to kind of wrap things up here, since I don't know if we have any questions or not, but
Yeah,
uh,
we have a few.
okay. The reason I think it's still relevant is the fact that, you know, quackery has always been with us and always still will be with us. And when I mention quackery, it's just the promotion of apparently miraculous medical devices and therapies that actually do not work. And the reason quackery lingers and is so persistent is the fact that organized medicine does not have all the answers, especially in connection with cancer. And there are a whole lot of problems with organized medicine in this country, especially regarding accessibility and affordability. As we speak here today, very much in the news is the murder of a health insurance executive on the streets of New York City, and just the anger directed toward health insurance and organized medicine that this murder has triggered on social media and elsewhere just shows how people are willing to believe the worst about the healthcare industry. So the conditions are ripe for things like Crebiasin to erupt and persist. We saw that in connection with COVID and in connection with a lot of other sorts of things. And there are legitimate concerns as well about so-called medical freedom, individuals who say, like, well, if I want to try something like Crebiasin and spend my own money on it, I should have the right to do that. Government agencies like the FDA should not be telling me I cannot do that. I should have the freedom to do that. And that can be a really persuasive sort of argument until you start seeing the damage that is done by quackery and by things like Crebiasin. The U of I, for example, sustained a great deal of damage from this whole affair to its reputation, specifically the medical programs in Chicago. But also, when someone like a prominent U.S. Senator like Paul Douglas says, the Food and Drug Administration cannot be trusted at all. The National Cancer Institute, part of the National Institutes of Health, cannot be trusted at all. That's corrosive and it's dangerous. So that's why things like Crebiasin deserve to be remembered and discussed, and why we have to keep our eyes out for further kerfuffles of this kind.
I think that before we move on to questions from the audience, that's a good note to end on. But one more, just briefly, Matt, could you talk about what it was that the FDA determined Crubizen was?
Well, they tested a number of ampules of Crebiasin that had been manufactured at different times. And in some cases, they found that there literally was nothing in the ampules but mineral oil, literally nothing else at all. And then in a few cases, specifically the ones that had been manufactured most recently as of 1963, they found that a spectrogram, or the chemical fingerprint of Crebiasin, matched that of creatine.
Mhm.
And whatever other benefits creatine might have in helping people recover from workouts and so forth, it never has been shown, even in the years since, definitively to have anti-tumor properties, especially in the minute quantities of creatine that actually were present in a Crebiozin ampule. But again, Andrew Ivy at the time said, but can you prove 100% that there isn't something else that might be in there in really minute quantities that actually might be the Crebiozin that has this miraculous anti-tumor properties? Why did these hearings last for so long and the trial last for so long? It's really, really hard to prove that something doesn't exist. It's just
Mhm.
really, really hard to to determine beyond a shadow of any doubt whatsoever that that's the case. And that's part of the reason this lingered for so long.
All right. Thank you, Matt. And now we'll move on to some questions from the audience. So one is, had Ivy published peer-reviewed papers himself? And if so, on what kinds of topics?
Yeah, he at least had attached his name to something like 1,500 such papers at the time he joined the U of I in 1946. I say he attached his name. Clearly, he had a central role in a lot of those. How big a role he did with all those papers, is impossible to determine at this point. But he was of an era where he had a hand, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, in all sorts of different kinds of medical research. Cancer was one. He had written in Science magazine a piece called The Biology of Cancer in 1947. Especially was known for his research on ulcers and on the digestive system. He had done stuff, as I said, for the war-related research during the war. He had done stuff on drug addiction and sexually transmitted disease. So in a way, that's really commendable that his interests were that broad. He was the designated spokesperson for medical ethics, ironically enough. So he had an interest in that as well. Interest or spokesperson at the Nuremberg trials. Arguably, that also meant that he spread himself too thin and that he was conversant in a lot of different subjects, but maybe not completely expert in a lot of them, including oncology. And that got him into trouble with cancer.
Can you, one question is, can you speak more on the interaction with the Board of Trustees and their reaction to Crebiozin and their faith or a lack of faith in Stoddard?
Yeah, the Board of Trustees was really split at that time. There were there was one trustee, for example, I believe it was Chester Bowles. I might be wrong about the name, but he was a Republican trustee. At that time, the trustees were elected by the people of Illinois and they ran on party slates. So he was a Republican elected trustee who was credited or blamed for being the person most responsible for recruiting George Stoddard to the University of Illinois. And in 1950, at a Republican Party convention in Peoria, a very raucous party convention, that's when the Republicans ousted this guy from their party slate and put Red Grange in his place with the idea that Red Grange would be a staunch anti-communist. And why that mattered for the University Board of Trustees is open to question, but it certainly shows that universities have been politicized for many, many, many years. It's not again, not a recent development. And so that's how Grange was on the Board of Trustees and the role that he played in ousting Stoddard. But it was something like a 6-3 vote, no confidence against Stoddard. There were people who were very pro Stoddard. There was one trustee, or maybe it was one or two, I can't remember for sure, who were not even told that the meeting was about to, that this vote was about to happen. So they were blindsided along with Stoddard himself, who had no clue that this vote was about to take place. The next president, full-time president who came along, David Henry, whom the administration building at the U of I is named after, Henry made it his business to have really good relationships with the Board of Trustees across party lines. So That was not an issue when controversies later developed. Stoddard was a different sort. Stoddard was very confrontational. Stoddard had an ego of his own and a temper of his own. And that was admirable in a lot of ways. It was full speed ahead with change at the university, which was good, but also got him into political trouble. And some of that was not his fault, but some of it probably was his fault.
You have this great line about how he was oftentimes guilty of a cold eye and a dour look.
Yeah, that was his own quote.
Yeah,
He
that's
he, he
that's
wrote
so
his
good.
memoirs where he said like, "Yeah, I plead guilty to that." And there was one state lawmaker, one very anti-Stoddard state lawmaker from Chicago, who said of George Stoddard, "That man insulted me just by the way he looked at me." And these are qualities that are not necessarily the best qualities for a university president to have.
Sure,
Come on.
especially one who's extremely liberal in a very conservative state at the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
um, the what was Red Grange's campaign slogan? Was it the only thing read about him is his name and his hair?
Well, that was the Republicans' slogan for him. Red Grange was, as near as I can tell, this essentially apolitical guy.
Uh-huh.
And after leaving the university without graduating to play professional football, he uh, was a sports broadcaster. He was a pitch person for Wheaties, um, you know, and he went along with being elected to the board of trustees. But really, his only agenda seemed to be not so much get rid of the liberals and hold the line against the Reds. It seemed to be more like, well, the music school has too many pianos. Why does the music school need so many pianos? And this abstract art that the art department seems to be obtaining, I don't see why this is art, why we should be spending money on it. And we really need a new basketball arena. I think that's something that the U of I needs. That was his agenda. Soon after the whole Stoddard affair, he left the board of trustees. And in an interview that he did in the 70s, he said, being on the board of trustees at that time, it just seemed to be a lot of people calling me up and saying, like, well, you got to put this person to work. You got to put that person to work. So patronage was not just a Chicago thing, it was very much a statewide Illinois thing at that time. When one political party took over, there was a whole lot of patronage positions that were supposed to be filled. Again, the trustees ran on a political slate and were affiliated with either the Democrats or the Republicans. And so that was something that Grange recalled with distaste.
That really cracked me up what his three main concerns were about being on the board: the abstract art thing and the no more pianos and basketball arena. I thought this is a pretty simple guy, but I, the when I read that he hated abstract art, I thought that tracks.
Yeah, and this was the era of abstract expressionism. It was the era of the Festival of Arts at the University of Illinois,
Hmm.
which started in 1948 and brought a lot of cutting edge art to downstate Illinois, to
Sure.
Champaign-Urbana. I mentioned my father was on campus at that time. My father actually was an art major,
Hmm.
and he remembered those Festival of Arts and people situating themselves in front of some of those representational paintings and kind of like going like, what is this? And of course, he and the other young people at the time who prided themselves on being cutting edge were like, yeah, well, we get it. And of course, they don't.
Yeah.
But that was the way things were on campus at that time. Lots of excitement going on, lots of change, lots of new ideas. And then a lot of people saying, like, this is happening too fast. And why is all this happening? And so that was just one example, Grange saying, like, why are we spending money on this? And of course, again, it's the kind of thing you see on university campuses today. Why are we teaching that? Why are students studying that? Isn't that potentially dangerous or kind of shady? And so trustee interference and legislature interference and donor interference, sorts of things that were percolating at the U of I in the late 1940s and early 1950s, just par for the course when it comes to state universities and public higher education.
We are right at time now, and I think that that is a good note for us to end on.
Not a very happy note, but
No, it's not, but I mean, it's, we're realists here, Matt.
yeah. Yeah, and we are blessed and cursed to live in interesting times when it comes to public health and public education and public science. And so I hope people, if they do read the book, will take away just some of the lessons that I hope history can teach us in putting these sorts of current controversies and the controversies we're bound to experience in the near future into historical perspective and remember why these things matter and why they're important and why it's important to keep faith in public health and public education and all those kinds of things.
Well said.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for having me and for taking the time to ask the questions. I appreciate it. And thanks to Sam and Christina and everyone else at the University of Illinois Press.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. And thank you for writing this book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And we'll be sending out a link to watch the video just in case anybody wants to send it to anyone. And we'll send out as well the discount code just in case you want to purchase a copy of the book if you haven't already read one. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time and have a great day.
Happy holidays.
Thanks.